Shike from the University of Illinois. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Animal Sciences. Today I'm going to be talking about drought management for the cow herd. Obviously it's been on the news. It's no surprise to any of the producers in the Midwest, and particularly here in southern Illinois, that we are experiencing extreme drought conditions, and producers are really wanting to know what their options are. And we have a great turnout here today because there's just a lot of questions that producers have. And so some of the key things that I'm going to hit on is first, you have to assess your own situation. What is your particular situation? I know generally speaking it is dry, but there are pockets where some guys have had more rain than others, and everybody has a different amount of pasture, and maybe some guys started the year with hardly enough pasture even on a good year. So everyone's situation is going to be different. You have to assess the status of your cow herd. Did you enter into this year with cows that were already in poor condition? Or were your cows starting the year out in good condition? Are you a spring calving herd or are you a fall calving herd? All those things will greatly impact the requirements of your cows. And so I'm going to talk about a few things we can do just from the management side on the cow herd. If you're a spring calving herd and you still have calves at the side of the cow, one of your best management tools that you have available is to go ahead and wean those calves early. That will immediately reduce the requirement on the cow. You can have more grazing capacity then. I realize no one's going to be looking to carry more cows, but at least there'll be more available forage out there for those cows. Right now those calves are probably eating 8 to 10 pounds of dry matter of forage themselves, not to mention still nursing and increasing the requirement on the cow. So that would immediately alleviate that stress on the cow, and cows will improve body condition and weight, and if you're still in the breeding season, it will likely improve your conception rates. I realize a lot of the spring calving herds maybe already have pulled bulls, and so we've maybe already missed that window. But if you still have calves at side, particularly if you still have bulls out in the middle of your breeding season, I would highly recommend pulling those calves off. Another thing that we're going to have to consider, and this is not really something that the beef industry needs, but you're going to have to consider maybe a little more aggressive culling. Our cow numbers are already extremely low, and so from an overall standpoint, from a supply, that may not be a great thing, but each individual producer is going to have to assess things. If you don't have enough forage, you don't have enough stored feed put away, with feed costs as high as they are, you still may want to consider a little more aggressive culling. Start with pregnancy checking. The first cow that should go is the cow that's not pregnant. That cow's not going to make you any money this year, and so you're going to have to throw away the ideas or the notions of the favorite cow, and you're going to cull the cows that are open first, and then progress to older cows, problem cows, and the last thing that you should cull would be a poor producing young cow. You've already got quite a bit invested in that young cow, so even if she's not the great producer, if she's still pregnant and young, her cost to replace later on is going to be pretty high. So that would be kind of the last resort. So those are really kind of the two main things as far as what you can do with your cow herd. The rest of the time I'm going to be focusing on what are our options for feeds. Like I said, the pasture is pretty much non-existent at this point, and so guys have already started feeding the feed that was really intended to be for winter. And so we're going to have a real shortage. Hay production was already going to be low because of loss of acres of hay, and then you compound that with the extreme drought. Our hay production's been very, very minimal. So just being able to find that hay is going to be difficult, and when you do, it's going to be very expensive. One of the things that we're getting lots of questions about is obviously what can we do with this drought corn. There's a lot of corn that's severely damaged with very little, and in many cases no grain. That corn does still have feed value, and so there's lots of questions, lots of considerations there. The biggest consideration for the producer on whether or not he can use this drought-stressed corn is what the nitrate levels are. And so that I would require that you test for nitrates. And there's many places that you can get that test done, and lots of documentation on what the levels are. Really, even if it's higher nitrate, you could still possibly use it if you dilute it and mix it with some other feedstuffs. And so you want to get that corn crop tested before you consider what you're going to do with it. And then how are you going to harvest it? How are you going to feed it? It can be green chopped, it can be baled, and it can be grazed. all three of those options honestly are not the first choice, because none of those options reduce any of the nitrate. So whatever nitrate level's in there, it doesn't matter if you green chop it, if you bale it and dry it down, or if you graze it, that nitrate is what they're going to consume. So if it's at a toxic level, that's not really a good way to do it. Really, the only time grazing should be considered is if it's so short out there and there's just hardly worth running equipment over it, then you may want to consider grazing it. But again, only if you've proven that the nitrate levels aren't toxic. Your best option for that is going to be ensiling it and making a silage, because ensiling it, depending on how good of fermentation you get, you will reduce the nitrates by 25 to 50%. And so that's a tool we do have to even deal with some of this corn that's too high in nitrate. So, you still need to, all the typical things we talk about when making silage, we still need to consider. Have to make sure our dry matter's at an appropriate range. We would like to have 35-40% dry matter to make sure we have a proper fermentation and make good silage. And so that needs to be considered. Now, the feed value of that silage is actually still pretty good, because when the corn plant doesn't make grain, it still retains the sugars in the plant, and so there's still pretty good feed value. So even on some of this corn that has near zero yield, we'll often see a feeding value of 75 to 80% or higher, and even with terrible yields of 40-50 bushel, that corn silage may have almost equal feed value. The biggest loss that we're going to have is going to be in tonnage. Clearly we're going to have much less dry matter, much less tonnage out there on a real poor yielding short plant than we would on a real tall plant with a lot of grain out there. So the biggest loss is really in dry matter, not so much in quality. So as long as it tests out on nitrate, it can make an excellent feed source. So I think that sure needs to be consideration. Now the other things that we have to consider is, the equipment, not just for harvesting it. There's plenty of guys that will custom harvest that and put it in a pile for you or bag it, but then how are you going to feed it? Do you have the necessary equipment to do that? There's still plenty of other considerations. Other things that need to be considered are what are the other low-cost forage options? We've really been promoting the use of crop residues, and throughout the Midwest here, and particularly in Illinois and Iowa, there's been a lot of work done on using some of the corn stalk residue bales, and that can be a real good option for the corn as well. If the producer deems there enough yield out there to go ahead and harvest the grain, we can still bale up some of that residue. Again, there's still some of the same concerns with nitrate, and again would want to test that. But corn stalk residue or wheat straw, any low quality forage, some of the CRP hay, some of that low quality forage can sure be utilized. And then the other thing that we would recommend as a supplement for that would be some of the corn co-products. Now I realize that they have also gone up dramatically in price, but they still are probably a viable option as an energy source, because everything's gone up in price. So I know they're very expensive, and some of our producers are, I guess, experiencing sticker shock, for lack of a better term, but you still have to just compare out on a cost per unit of energy basis, and those co-products are an excellent source of protein, an excellent source of phosphorus, and so they make a nice complement to a low quality forage for the cow herd. So there's certainly some options there. I guess as far as other crops, there has been some questions about soybeans. The soybean crop still has some hope, but we are approaching some areas here where soybean crop is in a pretty serious state as well. And so we can bale that also. Probably a couple things you want to consider there, just like you do with corn. You need to talk to your insurance agent, see where you're at on that, make sure before you do anything you're good on any claims. The other thing with soybeans, we need to make sure we know what they've been sprayed with as far as herbicides and pesticides. There are some that make it not suitable for forage for animals, so you need to make sure you check the records on that, check the labels before you do anything there. But if that checks out, then we can make that. If you're going to bale it, you certainly need to run it through a crimper. It can be pretty tough to dry down, but once you get it dried down, it will make hay. It's a pretty good protein source since it is a legume. Energy will be fairly low. It will be a much lower energy content than corn silage, but it will be much higher protein source. So we can salvage some of that drought-stricken soybeans as well. So, just lots of things, lots of options to consider. The most important thing, producers, again, just to kind of wrap things up, need to assess your own situation. See where you're at with your cattle, see where you're at with your forages and your stored feeds. you need to make a plan. You know, some guys were probably starting to think about winter feeding plans, and now we're already having to have a drought plan today. And so we got to get the drought plan taken care of, and then we need to keep thinking about the winter feeding plan. If you're going to explore the option of drought corn for corn silage, absolutely have to test it for nitrate. Once you know where you're at, then you can determine how you're going to be able to feed it. And like I said, you're just going to have to make some hard decisions and you know, take advantage of any of the cattle management strategies that may fit your herd. Try to put together the least cost options for getting through the drought and getting through the winter. And you know, sooner or later, hopefully it will rain and we'll get back on track. But everybody's going to have to make some really hard decisions and buckle down to get through this.